multiple things to test this. And one thing she did was just let's not look at scalars. Well, there's two different kinds of ways you can not look at scalars. And so one thing she did was look at materials, which are not scalars. So when something is plastic versus paper, for example, a plastic cup, a paper cup, and that doesn't have the same weirdness that scalars have, right? So you can't be like tall independent of the head noun, but you can be plastic independent of the head noun. So a plastic cup is actually, it's a cup, a thing that's a cup, and a thing that's plastic. And a thing that's a paper cup is a thing that's paper and a thing that's a cup. But not like tall doesn't kind of work that way. And so if it's really about inference and this are you saying enough kind of idea, then we should get the same inference for pick up the plastic cup where I've got like plastic can't help me, you know, there's two plastic things, there's a plastic spoon and a plastic cup. So I don't know which one you mean when you say plastic. And so when but if there's two cups, then I'm like, oh, you mean this one, okay? Versus if I don't have that other cup there, then I won't know which, you know, they'll be, I have to wait to hear what head noun is before one of these two, I think it is. And sure enough, in that situation, when you hear plastic, you look early when there's a contrastive head noun relative to when there isn't. Okay, then you can't know which of these two it is in those cases. But then she did this other thing. Well, she was like, oh, let's test it some more. And then she went to colors, okay? And colors, remember we talked about colors already, and they're kind of interesting. So materials sort of fit the pragmatic story very nicely. But colors didn't, okay? So look, in color, you do the same thing. So here it's like, so this is exactly the same sort of scenario, right? Where I say, pick up the blue cup. And there's two cups, one's blue and one's red, and there's two blue things. And so I hear blue, and I don't know if you mean this one or this thing, two blue things, but there's two cups. So if it was pragmatic, if it was about usage of that word to tell me which cup it was, then I should look early, you know, relative to this situation where I replaced cup with something else, which is whatever. But you don't see that here. So in this situation where you can replace, we have we have two cups versus one cup, it doesn't make any difference. If I say pick up the blue cup, you basically just can't decide which blue thing to look at early, whether there's a contrastive cup here or not. And any ideas for why that might be? People get the weirdness here? It's like a little bit weird, right? So compared, this one makes sense in terms of pragmatics, in terms of inference, that pick up the plastic cup, there's a contrasting cup, oh, plastic, oh, I don't know which thing you mean here. So in this situation, pick up the plastic spoon versus cup, I can't decide. And so I look randomly at those two things. But if there's an alternative cup for plastic, then I look early. And same with spoons, you know, so if there's some other kind of, you know, it's not the object itself. But for colors, it doesn't work that way. Any idea what's going on for people who don't already know, in case you already know? Yeah, Shashank.
One guess is probably the frequency of color usages as adjectives is much higher than other adjectives from a distribution sense. I guess one quick way to validate that would be to actually run a distribution on some corpus and see whether colors come up more often than non-colors as adjectives. And if that is the case, then somehow our model is primed to use colors not as a factor of disambiguating things, but rather like as a measure of, or like as some qualifier of some sort, of a much more commonly used qualifier. I don't know, that's a guess.
That's a pretty good guess. That's exactly right. So, so I don't know if, you know, many times I've taught this kind of stuff, and mostly people don't figure it out, and you figure it out right away. I don't know if, you know, good job, or anyway, so that's exactly right. So the idea is that that it's relative to the usage of the words, that the way that people typically describe these kinds of objects, in fact. And so if you ask people to describe these objects, they will actually tend to call that without any context. So with no other objects around, they'll call this a blue cup anyway, and they'll call this a red cup anyway, and they'll call this a blue toothbrush. So for some reason, with salient colors, easily labelable colors, people label the colors. They just label the colors. And so, you know, for my t-shirt, you know, you would just call this a red t-shirt if there's no other t-shirt around. People will often call, they won't call it a t-shirt, they'll call it a red t-shirt. And that's not true for materials, and that's not true for, so here, actually, I don't know if it's, you know, it's not true in general for the materials. Certainly for this plastic spoon, people would just call it a plastic spoon as opposed to, they might call it a blue spoon, in fact, as opposed to a plastic spoon in these cases. I don't know, like, I'm not sure if this is the best example here where paper cup and plastic cup, I kind of think those are actually typical labels for these things. You know, kind of depends, so it's a kind of relative, which is kind of amazing that this effect happens there anyway. So, the point of Shashank's point is that what we really care about is how these objects get labeled independent of context. And for whatever reasons, color terms get labeled, you know, maybe it's just because they're very saliently obvious in the objects that were in these experiments, which in Sedev's experiments. So it's not like every object was in all these experiments. It's just a few objects that she happened to have around, or she was able to find somewhere, where there was easily available contrasting identical objects. So they're actually not these objects. The Sedeve objects are identical, except for materials or color or size and height in some way. And it may be that the properties of those particular objects that she was using there, the colors may be just so saliently obvious in some, I mean, because like you go, like those kinds of objects, I can get